Think you know British cinema? Think again. Offbeat. British cinema's curiosities, obscurities, and forgotten gems.
Hi, I'm Julian Upton, editor of Offbeat, and today I'd like to talk about The Black Panther. Now, this isn't the 2018 Marvel superhero movie that cost $200 million, but the 1977 British crime thriller that cost, I'm offering a serious guess here, about $199.8 million less than that. The director was a 34-year-old British chap named Ian Merrick, who in his 20s had left the UK, gone to America to work for a grindhouse film production outfit owned by Barry Mahan. And one of the films they were involved in producing was the X-rated comedy noir Cry Uncle, which was released in 1971. Some years later, Merrick decided to return to the UK. He got back to London in 1977 and he was armed with a script that he'd written called The Keeper, which he planned to produce and direct. I spoke to Merrick back in 2011 and he outlined the Keeper script to me. It concerned a typical British psychopath, he said, who works as a park keeper, and the keeper develops a dangerous obsession with a young girl who frequents the park, in quotes, in skimpy clothes. And Merrick, by his own admission, was full of bravado at this time. Still a young man, he went ahead building the sets, hiring a crew even before he had all the funds in place, and he was even about to start shooting The Keeper when he was approached by the redoubtable Stanley Long of Alpha Films, who offered a distribution deal and help with the rest of the money. But there was one condition. Merrick was to ditch the Keeper script and instead make a film about Donald Neilson, aka the Black Panther. So Neilson, the Black Panther himself, had been caught just over a year earlier, in December 1975. And the arrest brought an end to a 3-year crime spree in which he'd progressed from domestic burglary to nighttime raids of post offices in towns across the Midlands and the north of England, armed with a shotgun. And he killed 3 people in these raids, but still didn't get away with as much money as he'd like. So in 1975 he'd moved on to kidnapping, having read about 17-year-old Leslie Whittle, who was due to inherit £82,500, which is about £500,000 in today's money, from her late father. Neilson put his plan into action. He kidnapped Whittle on the 13th of January 1975 from her family home in Shropshire. He took her to Bathpool Park, Staffordshire, and concealed her down a 60-foot drainage shaft where he tied her to a ledge. Then he demanded £50,000 in ransom from the Whittle family. What followed were a series of blunders on the part of Neilson and on the part of West Mercia Police and on the part of the press, who published details of a planned money drop and helped to screw that up. And so ultimately all the attempts to rescue Leslie were scuppered, and when she was found 2 months later, it was too late. So Neilson would be sentenced to life imprisonment in July 1976 for the killing of Leslie and for the killing of the 3 postmasters, and the judge imposed a whole life tariff. Ian Merrick then saw clear similarities between his Keeper script and the facts of the Neilson case, so he agreed to producer Stanley Long's offer. But the Black Panther project, as you might expect, was dogged from the start with controversy. Neil's conviction was fresh in the public's memory, as were the facts of Leslie Whittle's ordeal. West Mercia Police weren't happy. Merrick told me that he got threatening phone calls from them, saying stop this film or else. The journalists who'd helped mess up the operation also came down on the film, hounded Merrick as he was shooting it, bombarded him with questions like, "Are you going to show Leslie being strangled and murdered, Mr. Merrick?" But for all Merrick's background in grindhouse movies, he was keen to avoid sensationalising the material. He engaged researchers to fact-check the case and his script. The script he was developing with screenwriter Michael Armstrong. And this was a script that tried to avoid dramatic license where possible. Armstrong kept the dialogue to a minimum, based all of Neilson's actions and utterances on trial transcripts and media reports. And Merrick, as he shot the film, was also committed to seriousness. He filmed as close as possible to the actual locations where the events unfolded. And when his original lead actor, Ian Holm, dropped out, Merrick was pretty fortunate to find Donald Sumpter, a very young Donald Sumpter at that time, who brought this method-like commitment to his performance as Neilson. Merrick says that Sumpter even turned up to his audition dressed as Neilson. So all of these efforts resulted in a film that is sober and harrowing, but level-headed and pretty restrained. Much of the Black Panther plays out with a cautious but suspenseful wordlessness. Only subtle changes in Sumter's poker-faced expression throwing any light on the motivation behind his increasingly violent behaviour. The film isn't exploitative. There is one brief nude shot that seems rather tasteless and is not really necessary. It seems as if Stanley Long may have been pushing for that. But if anything, the film is a little too restrained, a little too cold, a little too mechanical. But if it was controversial in production, things were going to get a bit more heated in the run-up to its release. Stanley Long didn't help the cause when he granted an exclusive interview to the Daily Express about it. That incurred the wrath of the other tabloids. And Merrick himself was scarred by an encounter with Sue Lawley on BBC's Nationwide programme. Before the interview, Merrick told me that Lawley was really polite with him, and then when the cameras rolled, she leaned forward and said, "I've seen the film and I think it's sick." The BBFC also caused problems and delayed awarding the film a certificate. In the end, BBFC boss James Furman said he was letting local councils decide on whether or not to show it. Birmingham and Hull promptly banned it. But when the film played London, perhaps even worse, the London papers ignored it now. They didn't really review it. And even so, Merrick said it did quite well on its initial Piccadilly Circus run. But Michael Armstrong disagreed and said that the film was released on Boxing Day of all times. That killed it from the get-go. Plus it was a very bad winter. There's also another thing in that another film was released at that very same time. It premiered in Britain, and that was called Star Wars, which was competing for tickets quite vigorously. So what went against the filmmakers really, though, were their exploitation credentials. Stanley Long had for many years been active as a producer, director and distributor of soft porn films. Ian Merrick, while his career in America was not well known in Britain, those who'd seen Cry Uncle knew it was not exactly a merchant ivory offering. So the Black Panther was dismissed as outright as exploitation, by many in the industry even before they'd seen it, if they saw it at all. And the results for Merrick were catastrophic. The film ruined my life, he told me. I lost all my money on it. And he'd been so cocky when he arrived in London, but he had to go back to America with his tail between his legs. In the 80s, he went on to work for Francis Ford Coppola's Zoetrope Studios, so he got back on his feet. But meanwhile, Stanley Long had bought the Black Panther from the liquidators for £2,000. Did pretty well, releasing on his Alpha label in Britain as the home video market took off in the late 70s, early 80s. But by the mid-80s, Long's Alpha enterprise had gone under too. Merrick was eventually able to buy the Black Panther back for an inflated price of £50,000. And then the film went on to get a belated but respectful Blu-ray release, courtesy of the BFI's Flipside label. And it started to bring in some better reviews. And when I spoke to Merrick, and despite all the aggro the Black Panther had caused him, he said, "Well, I think the film stands up. I wouldn't have changed a frame."
Head Press. Publishing the books you love. Find us at headpress.com.
Hi, this is Julian Upton, editor of Offbeat, and today I'll be talking about the 1977 British crime thriller, The Squeeze. I'm not going to offer a review of the film, which is about a down-at-heel London cop trying to bring down a professional gang of kidnappers. You can find a review in Offbeat, a new and revised edition of which is out soon, or now, depending on when you're listening to this. I'm not going to go on about the great star, American star Stacy Keach, who in this is not only convincing as an Englishman, but also very convincing as a drunk, deadbeat English cop. I'm not going to talk about Carol White, here after her own Hollywood dream had turned sour. And as the kidnapped wife here, she undergoes a humiliation that has some jarring parallels with her own career. I'm not going to go on about David Hemmings, another swinging 60s icon like Carol White, but here, just a handful of years later, he's greying and heavier, but whose performance here of business-like intimidation is, in many ways makes him the most dangerous presence in the film. The infamous Freddie Starr is in it. He does very well in an unlikely role as Stacy Keach's chipper cab-driving pal. He offers some comic relief, something of a bromance even. Shouldn't really work, but it does. And nor am I going to go on about director Michael Apted, who remains mostly known as the driving force behind the brilliant, 7 Up, 14 Up, 35 Up documentaries at Granada. But he also delivered a handful of classic British TV dramas, and then probably 7 or 8 pretty good films. Some of them very good in Britain and Hollywood. He never became a named director though, because he was just a highly competent craftsman, I guess. So I'm not going to talk about any of that. What I'd like to talk about today is Stephen Boyd. Now, for me, Stephen Boyd was a revelation in The Squeeze. As crime kingpin Vic, he's only in a couple of scenes, 2 or 3, but he steals the film almost. What is revelatory is if you look back at his early career, the kind of roles he got, the way he looked back at his peak, then you just wonder where this performance as Vic came from, how he was able to summon it, and you wish he'd stayed around to give more of the same. If you compare his Vic in The Squeeze to his early performances like his breakthrough role as Masala in Ben-Hur, childhood friend and later enemy of Charlton Heston's Ben-Hur, back then Boyd was plucked from relative obscurity, a young actor from County Antrim, Northern Ireland, making his way in London, plucked for this major role in the biggest Hollywood event, really, the biggest film event of the time. And you could see why. He could act. He was just 28, or he may have been 2 or 3 years older, because his birth date varies in print sometimes. He had matinee idol good looks, chiselled cheekbones, square jaw, dimpled chin, thick dark hair, stood over 6 feet. But with all that, he had this kind of gentle manner, his sort of soft eyes, his sense of longing that he projected. There's the story that Gore Vidal, who did some rewrites on Ben-Hur, rewrote Masala's scene with Charlton Heston's Ben-Hur to have this homosexual subtext, and Boyd was aware of this, was in the know. We can argue that it's evident in some of the scenes, and the story goes that Vidal and the director William Wyler, and Boyd said, don't tell Heston for Christ's sake. But whether or not that's just a story of, that's just Vidal winding us up, he must have seen that sensitive beauty in Boyd at that time. And it's not just Ben-Hur that shows this sensitive, tender soul. It's very much there in other films like 1964's The Third Secret, in which he develops a friendship with a young orphan girl. It's there in a lot of these early performances. It seems like Boyd was like this in real life, He was just warm and loyal and friendly, perhaps a little effete, perhaps a little effeminate. He seemed to have been the proverbial nice guy in Hollywood. And that's perhaps why he couldn't sustain a career as a star. He signed a 7-year contract with 20th Century Fox, but when that expired around 1966, he fell into a series of Europuddings, European shot westerns and thrillers, TV movies, guest spots, that sort of thing. So after a few years in obscurity, Boyd turns up as a gangster in The Squeeze, and you think, what the hell happened? What the hell happened to him? Now, he's only in his mid-40s or thereabouts. He looks ravaged, leather skin, greying. Well, at least he does next to the Roman god he looked like 15, 20 years before. He's very lean. Maybe he was ill already, but he seems in no way frail. It's the kind of lean of a unrepentant middle-aged villain just after finishing a 10 stretch in strange ways, living on tobacco and smuggled in whiskey, getting his exercise by kicking the crap out of screws. He's kind of sinewy and lithe. Scowl on his face has become etched into a permanent mask of angry lines. And all this adds to his performance in The Squeeze, I think, which is striking, even if it's just confined to a small amount of appearances. His soft, lilting voice has gone. He lets rip with this down and dirty Ulster accent. And he's totally convincing as a hard nut, a head case, this force for bad. A bloke, if you crossed in some way, you'd have to emigrate. He's a crime kingpin, but he doesn't do his business from behind a desk. He'd be in there with the henchmen, torturing rivals or taking part in an armed robbery, roughing up men, women and children who got in the way. He's a nasty British villain for the 70s. He's got all the spoils. He enjoys all the spoils of his crimes, but he's got all the class of Kenneth Noy. And he's not your snarky John Osborne or your fat Alf Roberts or your half-pissed Ian Hendry from Get Carter. This guy's like the real face of London crime. A pair of tights pulled over his head, sawn-off shotgun at the ready, drink-hardened eyes, barking out obscenities to his minions as he kicks his way out of the back of a transit van. You see characters like this sometimes in the Sweeney TV series, but they have to stop short of swearing or veering into real brutality. Boyd in The Squeeze doesn't have those restrictions, and for me it's as memorable a performance as Ben Kingsley in Sexy Beast as Don Logan. It's all the more amazing in that it's just an extended cameo. I think if these characters were real, you put Don Logan and Stephen Boyd's Vic in a room together to sort out a difference. Don Logan would be running out for his mam after about 5 minutes. So The Squeeze was a great comeback for Boyd, although he'd never really gone away. And what makes it more profound is that just a few weeks after the film came out, he died of a heart attack on a golf course in California. He was either 48 or 45 or 49. Either way, he was young. And what's sad is that although Squeeze didn't make any money, it looked like Boyd might have gone on to get some better roles on the back of it. He was being lined up for a part in The Wild Geese, which was just about to be made, and that was one of those films that was a success everywhere except America. So it might not have been enough to reignite his Hollywood career, but I think it would have helped him continue to get major roles in bigger films. So sadly, we didn't see what Boyd would have gone on to do further into middle age, as a seasoned character actor when his looks didn't matter anymore. His real accent didn't matter. But at least we have him there in The Squeeze.
Head Press. Publishing the books you love. Find us at headpress.com.